All right, John 18, after saying these things that we just read in 17, that beautiful prayer, Jesus crossed the Kidron Valley with his disciples, and he entered a grove of olive trees. Judas, the betrayer, knew this place because Jesus had often gone there with his disciples. The leading priests and Pharisees had given Judas a contingent of Roman soldiers and the Jewish temple guards to accompany him. Now with blazing torches, lanterns, and weapons, they arrived at the olive grove. And of course, this is Gethsemane. Verse 4, Jesus fully realized all that was going to happen to him. Right? He knew it by revelation. He knew it by the scriptures. When he went to the top of the Mount of Transfiguration, it says Moses and Elijah appeared to him there, and they spoke to him about what kind of death he would die. And so he knew all about what was going to happen this night. It says Jesus fully realized all that was going to happen to him. So he stepped forward to meet these Roman soldiers and the Jewish temple guards. And he says, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus the Nazarene," or Jesus of Nazareth, the city of Nazareth. They replied. And he said, "I am he." And at least one of the translations I've got, that "I am" is all in capitals. And in fact, I'm wondering here, I think maybe in the Greek, yes, I was right. In the Greek, it just says, "I am." I am. Remember when God appeared to Moses in the Old Testament? And God tells him, "Go and deliver my people Israel." And Moses says, "Whom shall I say sent me?" And God said, "Tell them, I am that I am." And now Jesus says, they say to him, he says, "Who are you looking for?" And they say, "Jesus." And he says, "I am. I am." And so he just spoke those powerful words out of his mouth. And so it says Judas, who betrayed him, was standing there with them. And it says, as Jesus said, "I am," or some translations say, "I am he," but he literally said, "I am." It says they all drew back and fell to the ground. Now, can you imagine that? Here's some Roman soldiers, these rough, tough, savage men, and these Jewish temple guards who were also savage individuals, very rough, mean-spirited men. And they were there intentionally to arrest Jesus. When Jesus said, "I am," it says they all fell to the ground. Now, some people suppose that this is one instance of people being slain in the Spirit, that New Testament spiritual experience that we've seen before and some people talk about. But regardless, it says they all drew back and all of them fell to the ground like bowling pins, under a 16-pound bowling ball. Verse 7, once more he asked them, here they are all laid out like cordwood. He says, "Who are you looking for?" And again they replied, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I told you that I am." Again he says, "I am." And some other translations say, "I am he." But it's better to actually say, "I am." And it says, Jesus said, "And since I am the one that you want, let these others go." Verse 9, he did this to fulfill his own statement when he prayed the chapter before, and he said, "I didn't lose a single one of those that you've given me." He says, "Let them all go." Verse 10, then Simon Peter drew a sword and slashed off the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's slave or servant, who had gone along with this contingent to arrest Jesus. But Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Shall I not drink from the cup of suffering the Father has given me?" He's saying, Peter, I'm supposed to be arrested. I'm supposed to be tried. I'm supposed to be crucified. This is why I came into the earth. Shouldn't I drink the cup of suffering the Father's given me? Verse 12, so the soldiers and their commanding officer and the temple guards arrested Jesus and they tied him up. Now, why would they tie him up? They've got one man and all these soldiers, and they had to tie him up. And I think they were in fear. You think so? I don't know. But they tied him up. First, they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at that time. So first they took him to the Jewish religious leaders. Caiaphas was the one who earlier had told the other Jewish leaders it's better for one man to die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of the disciples. Now the commentators all argue about who the other disciple was. I personally believe it was John. who's writing this, and he's too humble to say, that Peter followed Jesus and I did too, and he just says another disciple. Most commentators believe that. Some believe that it was Mark. Later on, of course, we read the book of Mark, Matthew and Mark, and then we read about, Paul and Barnabas going on the missionary journey and taking young Mark with them. Some people think this was Mark. I believe it was John. It doesn't really say, so we don't know. Verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of the disciples. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, and so he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. So he shows up at the high priest's courtyard, and somebody at the gate says, "Oh, you're a friend of the high priest, come on in," right? And so Peter had to stay outside the gate. And then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching at the gate, and then she let Peter in too. The woman asked Peter, "You're not one of that man's disciples, are you?" He said, "No, I'm not." Because it was cold, the household servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. They stood around it warming themselves, and Peter stood with them warming himself. Inside, the high priest began asking Jesus about his followers and what he'd been teaching them. Jesus replied, "Everybody knows what I teach. I've preached regularly in the synagogues and the temple where the people gather. I've never spoken in secret. Why are you asking me this question? Ask those who heard me. They know what I said." And of course, they knew what he said already too. Every time he'd go speak somewhere, the Pharisees were there taking notes and trying to catch him in what he said. Verse 22, then one of the temple guards, so again, this is a Jewish temple guard, who was standing nearby, slapped Jesus across the face. "Is that the way to answer the high priest?" he demanded. Jesus replied, "If I said anything wrong, you must prove it. But if I'm speaking the truth, why are you beating me?" Then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas. Now, did Annas literally tie him up himself? I don't know. Probably he ordered the soldiers to do that. They tied him up, but they said Annas did it. Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, it already said that he was at the high priest's place. So how did this happen? Well, there were two men. They were related to each other, and somehow, the historians tell us, at that time, there were actually two high priests. There weren't supposed to be two high priests, but the Jews, who always were nitpickers about everybody else following the law, apparently at this point weren't following the law themselves. There was a high priest, maybe there was a retired high priest, and they gave the retired high priest the same privileges and respect and honor and opportunities that they did to the one that was serving as the high priest at the time. Anyway, then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. Meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire warming himself, they asked him again, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "No, I'm not." But one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus?" Again, Peter denied it, and immediately a rooster crowed. Now, you remember, Jesus had told Peter before that Peter had said to Jesus, "I don't know where you're going." He didn't understand about this dying on the cross and rising from the dead. He just knew Jesus was going somewhere. And Peter says, "I'm going to go with you." And Jesus said, "No, you can't go with me, Peter." And Peter said, "Man, I'll go anywhere with you. In fact, I'm ready to die for you." And Jesus says, "No, before the night, before the rooster crows, before the night's done, you're going to deny that you know me 3 times. Of course, Jesus knew that by the Spirit and prophesied that. So again, Peter denied it. And immediately the rooster crowed, fulfilling the prophecy, the prophetic word that Jesus gave him. And then it says, Jesus' trial before Caiaphas ended in the early hours of the morning. And then he was taken to the headquarters of the Roman governor. His accusers didn't go inside because it would defile them. Now, isn't that crazy? Here they are intent on killing the Son of God, and they're still trying to follow the nitpicky rules. They wouldn't go inside because that would make them unclean. They wouldn't go in the Roman headquarters. They were much too holy for that. And it says, and then if they were defiled, they wouldn't be allowed to celebrate the Passover, because they're right about to hit the Passover when Jesus was crucified. So Pilate the governor went out to them, and he asked, "What is your charge against this man?" And they said, "Well, we wouldn't have handed him over to you if he weren't a criminal." They didn't answer, what the charge was. They just said, of course he's a criminal. We wouldn't have brought him here if he wasn't. It says, then take him away and judge him by your own law. And he's saying, man, if you don't want to tell me what the charges are, then, you think he's a criminal according to your law. You go judge him. Take him away, judge him by your own law, Pilate told them. Only the Romans are permitted to execute someone. The Jewish leaders replied. This fulfilled Jesus' prediction about the way that he would die. And then Pilate went back into his headquarters and called for Jesus to be brought to him. And he asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus replied, is this your own question? Or did other people tell you about me? Do you want to know who I am? Do you want to receive me for yourself as the Son of God? He's actually witnessing to this Roman governor. And he says, am I a Jew? Pilate retorted. Your own people and their leading priests brought you to me for trial. Why? What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom's not an earthly kingdom. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate said, so you are a king. Jesus responded, you say I'm a king. Now, why did Jesus say that? Again, he must have said that prophetically. He said that by the Spirit. Because how many of y'all know God knows what you're saying in your own house? And Jesus, by the Spirit, knew what this man had said. I'm sure at some point he's talking to his wife or talking to a trusted advisor, some political leader. And he said, you know what? This Jesus is the King of the Jews. Jesus said, you say I'm a king. And then he says, actually, I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. No, now Jesus is getting down to the nitty-gritty and telling them what's really going on. It's not about a kingdom. It's not about subjects. It's not about fighting and wars. He says, I came to testify to the truth. And he says, all who love the truth recognize that what I say is true. What is truth? Pilate asked. Now, of course, this was in the days when the Romans ruled, and the Greeks were also very powerful, and the Greeks were great orators, and they were great philosophers, and they argued all the time about what the truth was. And Jesus says, if people love the truth, they're going to love me. And he says, what is truth? All he heard was all these different opinions out there. What is truth? And then he went out and again to the people. He went out again to the people and he told them, this man is not guilty of any crime. But you have a custom of asking me to release one prisoner each year at Passover. In other words, Pilate was doing everything he could to get out of arresting Jesus. He was trying to let him go. And so he says, you have a custom of asking me to release one prisoner each year at the Passover. Would you like me to release this King of the Jews? And so again, he calls him King of Jews. But they shouted back, no, not this man. We want Barabbas. And it says that Barabbas was a revolutionary. Another translation says he was a Jewish freedom fighter. In other words, he was trying to lead the Jews to revolt against Rome. And so they said, we want Barabbas. We want a guy that will fight for us and try to get us free from the Romans. Well, that's the end of chapter 18, and we'll go on in to chapter 19, then the various trials, the mocking, the beating, the spitting, the scourging, and all that's in tomorrow's reading. So I love you. Thank you for reading the Bible with me. There's some tough things to listen to in there, but always we see that thread of the love and the mercy of God towards us. Amen? That's what the crucifixion's all about, is God showing us that he loved us enough to send his own Son to pay the penalty for our sins so we could have the blessing. Amen. Amen. I love you. Talk to you again soon. Bye.